They're like, where's Aiden? Who was the last person to see Aiden? They're like, oh my god, no, he has gone back in. Why would he do that?
And the thing is, I was like, well, R.I.P. It's too bad you're gone. But they're immediately like, no, we got around to rescue. And I'm like, no, you don't.
That was not my reaction, Will. I was like, we have to save Aiden.
Man, he made his choice. He decided to do a dumb thing. Bye.
Guys, I'm back and welcome to another episode of Unresolved Textual Tension. My name is Lindberg. I am today's co-host, and with me I have the rugged, the handsome Fitzwilliam.
Thank you. Katie always forgets, so you're getting upgraded to Ultra, Katie. And today, what book are we doing, Lindberg?
Today we are doing a horror book called From Below by Darcy Coates.
To talk a little bit about horror on this channel, I've always really been interested in how you can do horror in prose, but I've also never actually read that much of it. Me and Katie, I think, have tried to read like 2 books in the past, and I've never read any of like the Stephen King that everyone suggests. And so I haven't read too much horror, so I'm very curious about how that works, because I kind of feel like I fundamentally can't be scared by prose just because it's like the monster isn't there. But I wanted to see, so we decided this one. We had seen good reviews on it. It looked cool. The basic premise is basically like the Titanic, but in the Baltic Sea, and maybe there's some weird eldritch shit going on, and it's a research team.
Can you let me?
I will hand it over to my illustrious co-host.
The premise is, it is 1928, April 20th, and the SS Arcadia has wound up 200 or 300 miles off course for mysterious reasons on its voyage from England to America. On the 18th of April, a strange distress call reaches the SS Margaret, where a strained, harsh voice says, "Pan, pan. Pan, pan," which is an international distress call. And the message reads as follows: "We don't know where we are. There are bodies in the walls." Skip to present day, where we have a documentary crew consisting of 7 people, who have found the wreck of the SS Arcadia and have been commissioned to do a documentary where they explore the wreckage.
And so, that's a really cool premise. It seems really cool. The book kind of alternates between the past storyline of the ship sinking and then the present one, and we'll talk about how that's it's a mistake that the author makes. But before we get into that, what's your credentials with horror? Where do you sit with having read horror?
I thought that I was a horror noob, but in hindsight, I realized that I've read a lot more horror.
Noob is derogatory. Newbie is affectionate. I'm using
Fine.
I'm using that face for a thumbnail. Go ahead.
No, please don't. You can't hold this against me. But I grew up reading horror. I have always been a little horror-ish person. Like back in school, my teachers used to be worried about my mental health because I wrote some seriously scary shit. And the reason for this is because I read a lot of horror growing up. I started reading Stephen King when I was 12. And from there, he kind of opened the door to all kinds of horrific novel content. This year, though, I have kind of been on a litfic bender. So this was the first horror I have read since Between Two Fires, which is a very different kind of horror. It's a historical fantasy horror kind of ish. But the premise to this book just sounded so interesting. Like, there is something so juicy about a sunken ship. No one knows what happened, and let's go down there and find out. But there is something terrifying behind this. So basically, I just told, well, please, let's do this one. I'm
not claustrophobic exactly, but I kind of feel claustrophobic in terms of the horror. Like, for me, this is a weird example, but very furry dogs make me uncomfortable because I feel claustrophobic with how much hair they have. And so the idea of going deep into the below the waves, into the crushing depths, like really was like, ooh, that's kind of an interesting concept and could be really good for horror. And those parts of the book are actually pretty good. It's when we get to some of the monstery type things that the book kind of really has problems. I think overall, and we're going to try not to do too many spoilers before we get to there, because, it is a horror novel. So just be aware that we'll try to keep things concurrent to what we know is going on in the story at that point. And so you can stop at any point you want. But overall, I felt like this book starts strong and then just kind of slowly goes down over time, and it gets weaker and weaker. And apparently the author has written a lot of horror stuff, and so I'm very surprised she makes some like rookie mistakes. And like I don't know. I'm looking forward to reading Pet Sematary, which is what we're doing for our next book club book, because that's supposed to be like a different type of horror, and it's Stephen King. And so in a lot of ways, I think that'll make for really...
It's very different.
Yeah, I think that'll make for a very interesting contrast. What did you feel like overall?
Do you remember before we started this book where you said that, this premise would be so good for a horror movie?
Yes, because it's already technically found footage.
I think you were really onto something there, because it's kind of structured like a horror movie, and some of these scenes we get later on that just didn't quite land for me on the horror scale would probably be scarier if you actually had a film camera to kind of see this happen with your own eyes through. Whereas in narration, it becomes kind of distanced and just a little passive for me. But I did really like the start of this book. Like, she really just gives you the characters and throws you into the situation right away, because in the first chapter, they have already arrived at the wreck. They are just on the boat chatting about what they're going to do and how this will be the first deep dive for all of them. And then she gives you a little expose on how dangerous deep sea diving is and all the strains it puts on the human body. And I thought that was really good.
Well, and it's so claustrophobic because she talks about how, like, she explains the bends, which is that as you go down, carbon dioxide, I think, gets stuck in your blood. And so if you go up, it will actually rupture through your body and kill you. So, like, they literally can't escape because it will kill them. So it takes 2 hours to get up. And they're running out of air while they're down there, and they need to remain calm. And like all of that, I thought was so interesting. And there's like one point where the book really capitalizes on it, but it's not quite ever the center of the horror. And the past storyline is a different type of horror that I actually liked more, even though I think the past storyline is not written as well. It's very telly and very like, well, and then this happened. And then that happened between the last chapter and this chapter. But yeah, the premise of deep underwater, crushing weight, I was like, okay. And it did start really fast. It was really good in that respect. I really liked how quickly it started compared to like some of the epic fantasy we've read. And I will say, I think there's a few key concepts to horror that we need to talk about going in, because what you said about it being a movie, like, I think that this would make for a good movie. I think this would make for a great game as well. The thing is that the way horror works is that if you're watching a movie and you see a scary monster, you are seeing something that scares you and elicits fear. I was just watching last night a movie called Azrael, which has like these burned one demons, which are based off of like their makeup is based off of very real burn scars, and just looking at still images of them made me uncomfortable. I kept wanting to, because I was reading something about how they were made. And so there's a one-to-one, I see a scary thing, I feel a scary thing. In a book, you can't really do that because all you're seeing one-to-one with your senses are words on a page. And so the place that books really, I think, can do horror best in their real strength, because we've talked before on the channel about, playing to the strengths of your medium, is character thoughts. And when I think about the horror that I have read that's really effective, like the Sam chapter in A Song of Ice and Fire, and even the predatory
Which is
horses
ironic, because they are not even horror books.
Well, sometimes horror works best in mediums where you weren't expecting it, because you have all this buildup and it's so scary because you already have a normalized world. Or like, again, the predatory horses and Scorpio races, like, the things, because me and Katie actually went through and did a deep analysis of that chapter where they're getting chased by one, and like it's scary because the character is scared and you feel what the character is feeling and the thoughts, and you fall into that. And that happened a little bit in the final timeline for me towards the end, or the past timeline towards the end. I started feeling that a little bit, but in the present, the characters are all a little they don't really react. There's not a ton of internality. They're not even super likable. Like they're okay sketched for like an action book, but like if this is horror, it's not really there. And like the monstery parts don't really work on that emotional or mental side, I felt like.
Well, let's just say that horror in written form is all about imagination, because a reader's imagination will always be scarier than anything you can write on the page. And that is kind of what Will is trying to strike on with that the internality of the characters is really what drives the reader's imagination as well. Their imagination of what they're perceiving reflects your imagination and heightens your emotion as you're reading. But
Yeah.
I like that the characters aren't all very likable, because it contrasts. Like the one really smart thing this author did was that she put the most likable character, arguably, even though he isn't very competent, Aidan, she put him in a very perilous situation, which was a smart.
Go ahead.
Of course you didn't. But Ada, you can at least agree that he's the least asshole-ish character. He's not really qualified to be on this trip,
Yes.
and arguably, like he doesn't actually. He's a bit of a dead weight in the water, but he is very likable. He is very amiable. You know that he. We find out in chapter 3 that he wants to. Propose to his girlfriend when he returns gloriously victorious, like successful from this trip. So we have that kind of hook where if you don't find him repulsive, as Will did, you kind of can see that he is a nice guy and you don't want something bad to happen to him. And maybe the author is showing your hand a little too much. It is quite obvious that she wants you to like Aidan and care for him, because he's the baby of the group. He's the youngest. He's only 22. And this is basically his first dive at all. Like, he hasn't much diving experience at all, and he barely scraped by his certificate. So she does this really clever thing where she kind of puts him in some of the most tense situations. And those were some of the interesting bits for me. And I also liked Hesty's narrative chapters, because Hesty is the marine biologist of the film crew, and as such she has a lot of insight into how the ocean works and a lot of respect for the ocean, because she is not this kind of marine biologist, like she's not Steve Irwin who likes hugs sharks and go like, oh wow, look at this stingray. I can't do an Australian accent.
That was excellent. It was uncanny. It was like I was back in the early aughts.
But anyway, she doesn't actually like being in the ocean that much. So she is very intimidated by the ocean setting, and that kind of heightens the tension in her narrative chapters. Whereas some of the more boring ones for me was Cove, because she is just floating around rationalizing everything.
So we should actually probably describe the team, the characters in the current storyline. So you have Cove, who's like, she does documentaries, and she's like she's competent. She's supposed to be like the kind of producer character, but you're actually supposed to be kind of sympathetic to her. This book also jumps between POVs, and I didn't like that. But I think that's kind of a narrative thing where I always like a little bit more of a claustrophobic POV, especially for something like horror. And so she's an okay character. She's sympathetic, but I almost feel like she's too every woman sympathetic to really work as a character. And then this book also has a problem where right at the end, it remembers there's supposed to have been some character growth. So the characters have moments of like, and then I overcame this struggle. And you're like, that was not seeded throughout the book. So that's Cove. She's the main girl. Then there's Roy, who's like the hyper cameraman, who's kind of like a dude bro. And takes care of like Aiden, who is like a PA assistant who should not be diving to these depths because he basically just got in. And I can't remember what excuse they have for him to be doing this, but he just shouldn't be.
It's basically that Roy likes him, and Roy is a bit of a, that dude who is very opinionated and kind of takes up a lot of space. So he basically just said, take my buddy Aiden. And he did a test filming, and Cove thought he presented well on camera, so that's why they have him.
It's sort of flimsy because the problem is the author wants you to think that Cove is competent, but then she's having Aiden like along for the ride, and like the author tries to counter it by having her at the very last minute go like, man, I shouldn't have Aiden come on this, but he already jumped into the water. And I was like, okay, but you can't have it both that Cove is competent and that she is going to do something like this.
We kind of get this as well, because in Cove's introduction as a character, she talks a lot about how documentary filming is all about kind of exaggerating how much danger you're in order to hook the viewer. So she would be filming in a blizzard on a mountainside, talking about how hypothermia is lethal in these circumstances, while at the same time, off camera on the set, there's a helicopter just waiting to take her back to her hotel. So there is kind of this theme of perceived danger in documentaries to catch viewer interest versus actual danger. And I think we're supposed to take from that Aiden is here because he is a good character to kind of heighten that sense of danger with this dive. But it is also a bit of a cheesing moment because this dive is actually very dangerous.
I would have loved that as a theme, actually, that usually she's used to going into these perceived dangerous situations, but then halfway through this book she realizes like, oh no, this is an actual dangerous situation. There aren't copters like off in the distance, or above me, like I'm underwater, there is nowhere to go.
Yeah, we could have had a stronger moment of that. I guess we're kind of supposed to buy also because right away the book tells us that they were supposed to have drones to explore this wreckage with. So they would have 4 days of drone footage, and then they would just do a single dive at the end, just kind of pad out the footage. So I believe the idea we're supposed to take from that is that their dive would be, to the safer parts. They wouldn't actually go that deep into the ship. They wouldn't be in very cramped spaces. Like they would do a safe dive that would look good on screen. So you can, if you squint, you can see the shades of it, but it's not entirely supported by the text.
Yeah, I actually would have liked that as a scene, as if they had gone in with the drones first, and then and we actually got the scene where the drones stopped working. Because that's what happens. Is originally Sean, who is another character who's just like kind of a weird, I don't even quite know why he's on there. He's there to cause some strife, but anyway, he's the drone operator, but his drone stopped working when they went into the depths.
Well, there's a reason to why we couldn't have that scene that we're supposed to kind of buy, but that would have been cooler, because the whole book we kind of wonder why the drones aren't working, and it would have been kind of cool for them to just kind of go down, and suddenly there's this static, this interruption, and then the drones die in the water. Unfortunately, that isn't the intrigue the author went for.
And then also from a character perspective, it would have been good, because it would have been like, oh, she had this plan that was going to keep everyone safe, but she needs the money because that's going to be her main motivator, is that she like needs the money from this documentary. She needs to get a certain amount of hours of footage.
Cove is bankrupt because her father got cancer and needed experimental treatments that wasn't covered by their insurance. So she took out loans to pay for it.
And the thing is, this company that they're working for is very, they need exactly 12 hours or they're not going to be paid of footage.
Vivitech Productions is a cutthroat production company. They wanted 36 hours of footage from within the wreck, but Cove managed to negotiate them down to 12 hours. But this company also has a history of doing bad faith judgments, because she cites a man who went to the jungle to do footage, and he got a leg infection and had to be hospitalized. and they use that as an excuse to kind of underpay him. So Cove is very, aware of this and very set on that she really needs the money. She needs
And
this to
the
be a
thing is,
success.
this is a place where I think the structure and the POVs clash, because if she was a character we were outside of and she'd been making all these dangerous things and halfway through the book we discovered she was bankrupt, it would be like, oh, okay, this is adding some nuance to the character of she's not just an asshole pushing her crew into danger, she kind of has a reason. But because we're in her point of view, I would have liked if that had been in the outset, so we could have seen her be like a little bit more desperate in terms of like, I need this money. And so treating it as a halfway reveal doesn't really do anything to the audience, and that's an issue we're going to run into, is that the author is not very good at parceling out information in an effective manner between really the past timeline and the present one, but even here, like there's minor ways.
Cove is the first point of view we get, and from the moment the book starts, we hear Cove being very cautious and thinking a lot about the safety of the crew, and that doesn't really juxtapose her need for money. So it's kind of brought up as a throwaway thing when Sean is angry about his drones not working. So he's like, oh, Cove really needs this money. That's why she's pushing so hard. And you as the reader, you go, well, she doesn't really seem to be pushing that hard,
Yeah, that was my reaction too. Is like, she's actually been getting a lot of affirmative consent from her crew on how to do this.
Yeah, why are you being such a bitch, Sean? Sorry, we haven't even introduced Sean yet.
Well, Sean is, again, he's just the drone operator who stays on the ship and is a little bit of an asshole. Like, that's really all his character is, to cause a little strife.
He's a bit of a waste of a character in this book entirely. Like, he was supposed to be the star, the drone operator taking all this footage, and he gets really pissed off and really angry when his drones aren't working because now he has nothing to do, so he makes life miserable for the rest of the crew, basically.
Which, to be honest, I liked as a motivation. Like, that kind of makes sense in terms of, like, you're doing this, like, thing.
It's so petty.
It really is.
I mean, it's good as a character motivation. Like, he's a good character. He has a distinct personality, and you understand his motivation, but he's so annoying. I hate him.
And again, we'll talk later about how Lindbergh also hates Roy, the kind of hyper cameraman. So it's interesting she chose the two straightest, whitest male characters to dislike.
At one point, I was like, oh, I was wrong about Roy. He's quite okay. And then he reveals something. I was back to, oh, he's such a shit. Fucking Roy.
Then the other character, right, is Hestia, who's like kind of an oldish, I think, just from the voice the narrator does, marine biologist who like is just along to say some sciencey stuff, even though this isn't her area of expertise, really.
The book at one point says she's almost twice Aiden's age, and he's 22, so she's about 40.
The final member of the team. Well, okay, and then on the ship, there's a rich guy who owns the ship called Devereaux, who I don't know why he's in this book. And then there is Vanna
Ford.
And she's like quiet and like kind of sociopathic, and you think, ooh, there's something going on with her. What's going on? Is she going to betray the team?
Vanna is presented as the diving instructor. She has over 4,000 logged dives. She's a very famous cave diver, which are like the rock stars of the diving world, because they go into these dangerous, cramped spaces, and it's a very risky diving.
If you've ever seen like
experience.
YouTube videos on cave diving, it's
fucking
terrifying.
Oh, I can't. Jesus. Yeah, I have a couple of times, and I've regretted it every time. These people have no sense of self-preservation. Like, they want to die. I don't understand.
And they don't just want to die. They want to die in a way where they're going to slowly suffocate while being unable to move back.
In a terrible, horrible way, yeah.
And I actually liked her. She probably was my favorite character, just because, like, you just kind of think something mysterious is happening with her, and you don't never really quite know what until
she doesn't
find out.
Talk to people, and she's like ruthlessly efficient, very professional. Pretty soon, Sean ends up finding her diary, and in this diary she has written some really disturbing things. Basically she writes, I watch as you drown, the bubble escapes from your mouth, you try to breathe but there's no air, I watch you drown. So he gets like, oh, Vanna is sus, she is sus as fuck, she's gonna do something, and she's gonna hurt these people. She's psycho, and the entire book we're like, is she sus? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of liked Vanna. I was like, no, don't be sus.
And the thing is,
Please.
I as a reader immediately was like, oh no, this is too early in the book. She's not gonna have, like, this is not real. Even though I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be like visions of things to come, like she had some kind of connection to this.
Yeah,
this
it could have been
ship.
cool.
And it does add like a nice little bit of tension right at the beginning, because he finds this after they do their first dive, which again happens like in the first chapter.
He finds it during their first dive.
Right. And so it's like, oh shit, they're down there with her.
Yeah, and he runs up to Devereaux and he's like, Devereaux, you need to get them up. You need to get them out of the water. And Devereaux's like, well, I was supposed to be able to communicate them, but this solar flare, it knocked out our communications. So, they're down there by themselves. So at that point, it was okay. Like, I was like, oh, maybe... You kind of think that maybe she's sus, but at the same time, if you have read enough books and you are jaded enough, you're like, no, it's not going to be. It's too early.
It's too early. Yeah, exactly. Like there needs to be some kind of a twist to this. And so they jump into the water and they go diving down. And this part is cool because the author really knows what they're talking about when it comes to the diving terminology in terms of like, okay, this is what's going to happen as they go down. And once they're in the water, it is a little terrifying because it is like you have to move slowly. If you move at all, the silt will come up and just hang in the air and your visibility will become zero.
Yeah, because this ship sank in 1928. So it's been on the ocean floor for 100 years.
Yeah, and at one point, you also don't know what's structurally sound. At one point, Cove like has some bubbles come out of her rebreather, and she realizes they're coming out to the side, and it's because when you're underwater, it's actually very hard to figure out which way is up, and it's very disorienting, and it's all dark.
Yeah, you don't have gravity to aid your sense of direction.
And this needed just a little bit more character interiority to really sing. I found it creepy, but it would have been creepier with just a little bit more like sensory detail or characters thinking.
During the first dive, the author did this really clever thing that she switches into Sean's perspective. At first we see Cove and she's watching Sean kind of swim. He paddles really fast, like he's really trying to keep up with the others. She's like, Aiden, your buoyancy. And they have these inflatable bags on their kit that they can fill with air for them to float more. Like float harder. I don't know diving terminology, so don't shoot me.
Buoyancy.
But he's like,
buoyancy.
I forgot about the buoyancy. So he lets out air and he can keep up with the others. And when they reach the bottom, we switch over to Aiden's POV and he looks at his oxygen meter and he realizes that he has expended so much oxygen trying to swim too hard and just being kind of nervous because he's young, he's inexperienced. So right away when they get to the bottom and see the wreck, they're like, let's do an oxygen check. And everyone's like, oh, I have 85, I have 83, I have 80. And their rule for the dive is that 1/3 of the air goes for the descent and the exploration, 1/3 for their ascent, because they have to depressurize during their ascent. And during a deep sea dive, ascent needs to be very, very slowly because all of the carbon monoxide that's been stored inside of your body because of this deep sea pressure will be condensed into bubbles inside your body. And if you rise too quickly, you get very sick. So 1/3 of their oxygen is for the ascent and 1/3 is supposed to be in spare. And when Aiden looks at his diving meter, he is on 75% air already, and everyone else is at 80 plus. And she's like, how much air do you have, Aiden? He's like, I don't want to be the person who messed up and ruined the fun for everyone else. He was like, I have 81. When really they were supposed to end the dive if he rose beneath 75.
And it's a good tension, and I wish more had been done with the whole idea of the air and how little there was. And that's the thing, is that I feel like they jump into this dive too quickly, because I feel like just a little bit more would have allowed her to stay underwater longer in this sequence, because they have to come back to the ship to kind of normalize things, so like they all survive this dive type of a thing, and I felt like more cool stuff could have happened, and yeah, and it, like, that's actually, again, a very interesting idea too, about like you have to stay calm. It's kind of like Jurassic Park gets away with having everybody stay still when the monster can't see you, through the thing of like, oh, the dinosaurs only see movement thing, which is like, okay, you have to stay still, but you want to run. And in this kind of a situation, it could have created I want to run, but I gotta stay calm. I gotta stay calm kind of a dynamic, and that doesn't really ever happen.
No, because we switch away from Aiden's point of view. So all of that tension that is kind of hinted at with his oxygen running low and him not feeling comfortable enough to talk about it is kind of nullified, because we are not in his head watching the dive meter just tick lower and lower and lower while he's like looking for someone else to call an end to the dive for reasons, but they just don't. They just keep going until he is basically about to run out of oxygen when they finally emerge. And we only find that out after they're back on the boat. And it's like, oh, this could have been such good tension to just slowly heighten the reader emotion and really instill in you just how dangerous it is. Like, it would be so much more tense to watch his diving meter just tick down than to be told when they are back on the boat that he retches because he was so nervous that he was going to choke. I was like, okay.
That annoyed me, because I was like, that could have been really that's really the terror to tap into on the modern day storyline. And okay, so what happens in the first? Basically, they explore the ship, and it's like a little bit creepy.
They approach the ship, they touch the bow, they read the name, it's the Arcadia, and they found a breach in the wreck where she has rubbed against the rocks on the bottom of the ocean. So they enter through that, and they enter in the second class department, and basically they find a lot of storage, luggage, and the cabins don't look like they've had people living in them, so they figure that, oh, this ship was probably not running at full capacity, so they have just extra luggage down here. And so they decide to go up a level to the first class cabins, and there they just swim around. They realize that there's fabric, like there's mattresses on the bed still, and after 100 years, we all know that should have decayed by then. And that's where we get one of the most damning inaccuracies of this entire book.
Okay, so we did this by accident, but Lindbergh is Swedish, and this book actually takes place in a sea that's right next to Sweden. So Lindbergh actually knows a lot about it. And while I was reading the book, I was like, oh, I'm so impressed the author knows so much. And that's not accurate, I think you were saying?
Sorry, is this time for my Gulf of Bothnia spiel?
Hit me with it.
We are given the explanation that the Gulf of Bothnia, which is the northernmost part of the Baltic Sea, it borders on Finland and on Sweden's eastern coast. And the Gulf of Bothnia is notoriously, it's very brackish water. The oxygen, the salinity levels, like the salt in the ocean, the salinity levels are notoriously low because the Gulf is fed by a lot of freshwater streams. So the salinity is actually as low as 0.1 to 0.3% in the parts where this dive takes place. And the marine biologist, she tells us that the lack of currents in this northern bay is the reason to why there is almost no salt in the water, which helps protect the wreckage, because salt is corrosive, as we all know. But she also gives the explanation that there is also almost 0% oxygen. There is 0% oxygen in the water. So the wreck is the closest thing to a sterile environment that you can get. And this is just entirely inaccurate. She explains it by the lack of currents don't bring in fresh oxygen into the water, and that's why it's hovering just above the freezing temperature and there is no oxygen. But as a northern person who has read a bit about the Baltic Sea, if it sounds good.
I was like, oh, wow, this is so cool.
If you think about it for more than 1 second, it's like, but the Gulf is fed by freshwater streams, which are oxygenated.
I was wondering about
so
that.
where does the oxygen go? There is this phenomenon in the Baltic Sea that's called eutrophication, which is basically that too much nitrogen and phosphorus end up in the water, and that leads to algae blooms. And the algae, when they bloom, they consume a lot of oxygen. And then the microbes that break down the algae, they also consume a lot more oxygen. And then when they die, they sink to the bottom of the ocean. And during this process, they have eaten so much of the oxygen that the bottom of the sea is basically dead. But this is mostly a phenomenon in the southern part of the Baltic Ocean because the brackish water there has a top layer of oxygenated fresh water, and the bottom layer with salt water is a lot heavier. So all the dead water ends up on the bottom. And this just doesn't work for the Gulf of Bothnia because there is almost no seawater up there. As I said, 0.1 to 0.3% salinity. And while there has been, in the deepest parts of the Gulf of Bothnia, there have been areas where there is hypoxia, which is low oxygen content in the water. There are no dead zones, as the biologist explains this is. So basically, it doesn't make sense.
I think basically she should have just come up with a fake sea, and that would have been fine. If she had just been like, if she had just named it something, I don't know, Swedish, like sea, and then it would have been, fine. That's why you write fantasy instead of historical fiction.
I don't know if she was like, nobody's gonna care. No one will care. No one cares about this Swedish Gulf. Who the fuck cares? Or she just thought that no one would know, because you don't actually have to do a lot of research to fact check this. And the problem for me is that the entire explanation for this book just kind of falls a bit with it. It makes no sense that there is no fish.
To me, it made sense, but I don't really know science or the area. And because she'd gotten a lot of the other details right, it seemed plausible, which is actually, weirdly enough, a good thing to note if you're writing fantasy, which is if you get enough of the real details right, people will accept the not real thing as real very easily. But yeah, I don't know why she wouldn't just make it like a fake sea then. Like, it's weird that, or maybe she just didn't do her, I can't imagine she wouldn't do her research. Maybe she just didn't care about Swedish people.
I think she did do her research, because it feels like she looked at, she Googled dead zones in the ocean, because she had this premise of there's being no oxygen that preserves the wreck. And she got the Baltic Sea, but she was like, but there's too much traffic in the Baltic Sea. And the Baltic Sea is basically obsessively monitored by Swedish and Finnish authorities because it's such a sensitive environment. So she was like, oh, but there can't be a wreck in the Baltic Sea that has gone unnoticed for 100 years. So she was like, but what about if we go more north when no one's looking, when no one cares? There could be a wreck in the Gulf of Bothnia, because some of the depths there, they reach over 400 feet. And there is not as much traffic. It's not as interesting to biologists because the water is so brackish there. It's not as sensitive. So she thought that is the most plausible place for a ship to lie undiscovered for 100 years. But then that clashed with her dead zone premise,
Yeah,
and she was like, but
close enough.
suspend your disbelief, everyone.
Yeah. Yeah,
Most
I
people
mean,
won't notice.
I think that's one of those things. It's interesting because another aspect of being too much of an expert for this book was the ways they kept talking about the documentary. As somebody who edits video, they kept saying things like, she didn't say anything though because she didn't want it to end up in the documentary. And I'm like, you can just have the editor is going to make you look good. Like, you don't need to worry about saying dumb things. Like, the only time you would
Yeah.
need to not say those is during a scene that can't be cut or something like that. And so and that kind of bothered me every once in a while, is that they just didn't seem to understand how movies are edited. But yeah, I guess for most people, it would kind of go under the radar.
Yeah. It's not so outrageously wrong that it breaks the book. It just doesn't entirely make sense all the time.
Basically, that's what they find out, that there's no life here because there's whatever.
Yeah, there's not going to be fish. There's not going to be sea sponges, and everyone's like, "Oh, we can get the sharks in HD." Roy, he's a jokester. He likes to make funny jokes. Oh, so funny. So he's like, "Oh, we'll get the sharks in HD," and the biologist, she's like, "Oh, there's not going to be any sea life because there is no oxygen in this ocean." So in the wreck, they find mattresses, they find curtains, they find things that should have been decayed by now.
And really haven't. And we'll also, at the end of this, as they're rising back up to the surface, they'll find a corpse that's perfectly preserved. Besides being like a shrunken mummy thing, because it's been... And I thought that was kind of cool, because I've heard before about mummies from Europe where they went into bog marshes where there just is no oxygen. So they're essentially, they come back up and they're like very well preserved. And again, I was like, "Oh, she did her research. That's so cool."
Yeah, you get this explanation that the microbes in the body, the bacteria in the body that starts the decaying process would have been active, but because there is no oxygen in the ocean, the bacteria would have died and the body would have remained in this kind of beginning decay state, but still fully intact after all these years. So they have clothes, they have hair, they have skin, even though it's weird skin, because the fat in the body has kind of risen to the surface. So they have like bubbly, gross skin. And Roy is the person who finds this body, and he is viscerally repulsed by bodies. He's like, "Oh, get me away from this thing." He starts screaming, which is kind of funny because he's this big burly dude. You're supposed to think that he's the macho man, and then he just breaks down and screams like a little girl when he finds a dead body.
That's a very sexist stereotype. But yeah, and so and like it is creepy at first because you think that they're gonna have to rise to the surface with this body next to them or something like that. But then they just skip to being in the surface at the end of the dive.
I actually thought that since they were screaming and panicking, they would use too much oxygen and their ascent would be really tense because they would be like watching their dive meters tick down and stuff. But we didn't really get that either.
There's a lot of this book we don't really get. Like, there are things that you would expect that then just don't really happen. What notable happens on the dive? I think they just find creepy stuff. They find some writing that says "keep them out" or something like that, like video game style.
Yeah, they find the walls are blocked up with a lot of chairs and rubbish, and someone has scribbled on the walls, "They came through here." And then there's a long arrow just turning a corner, just pointing at a place in the solid wall.
And it's kind of creepy, and you're like, okay, this is kind of weird. And, it's good for a first dive. It's like, okay, we've kind of found out the shape. We kind of know what's going on in the ocean. There was a creepy dead body.
And I don't think this was the author's intent, but this book really made me feel like, oh, it's so goddamn cool. I want to deep sea dive into a sunken ship. This is so awesome. I want to float around and look at the cabins and look at their luggage and things and try to understand what happened to them. Like, that part of the mystery of this premise really gets me going. I love a mystery.
This book was very compelling for me to read. I read it in one sitting, 6 hours, because I read at double speed. And a lot of what it was is like, I wasn't scared, but I wanted to know the mystery. I wanted to know how this ended up. Towards the second half, I stopped, but I was already listening, so I just finished it. But it was compelling, especially for that first half. And I think in a lot of ways, it works better as a mystery. There's a tension we're going to talk about later with horror, which is that horror movies and horror stories are often framed as a mystery. So it's supposed to be scary, but also you want to know what's going on. And there is a fundamental tension there, because when you find out what's going on, often that ruins how scary the thing is. Your imagination is scarier than whatever you could show on screen or the answer that you could give to this thing. But at the same time, and so like the more you reveal the monster, like you want to be able to see in Alien, the xenomorph is often kept in shadow right until the end when he comes out and he's all like a guy in a suit, right? And you're like, oh, that's terrifying. But he's not scary in any of the other movies because we now know what his shape looks like. It's very pedestrian. And some movies have the problem that they won't reveal enough at the end, so you kind of feel cheated from the mystery aspect of it. But if they reveal too much, you're cheated from the horror aspect of it. And this book kind of has the problem that it reveals too much of the horror. And I think we'll talk closer to the end about ways that I think horror stories can kind of mitigate this problem, but the mystery of the side of it just kept it compelling, even as the scary part didn't.
Yeah, I tandem read this book as an audiobook and as an ebook, and I think all in together, I've read this book 3 times now, and it is tense enough and it is engaging enough for me to be amused, even the second and third time I read it. Like, I like this book, even if I think the horror didn't really strike for me. Like, I don't read it as a horror novel. I read it as an exploration of a sunken ship, and I'm like, yes, get me down there. I want to swim.
It's disappointing in a lot of ways, and I think this book could have been fixed in the second half. But they get back up to the surface. Sean doesn't tell anybody about the creepy journal he read.
No, he just mopes around with the journal behind his back and just stares angrily at the whole crew. And Aiden also doesn't tell anyone that he was about to run out of air and suffocate.
And I was like, okay, I don't know why we included that if that's all we were going to do.
It's like the author thought that, oh, realistically, they can't stay down there and they're going to expend the most oxygen on the first day. So we'll have to have them come up and eat some dinner and go to sleep and then try again tomorrow. So we got that entire bit, like, okay.
That's exactly how it feels.
During the evening, though, Sean does talk to Cove about the journal. The thing is, we don't really get to see the scene where he talks to Cove.
Oh god, it's such a dumb decision.
It's just, we end up in Cove's narration the morning after, and she sort of thinks back to Sean coming to talk to her, and then her going to talk to Vanna, and we don't get to see their conversation at that time either. So we just get to see Cove say to Sean that, oh, the issue has been resolved. Vanna's creepy diary is none of your business. Just mind your own business. Let's get going. Vanna's going to die with us.
It's such a weird decision because it saps so much tension from that plot line, because now you know it's nothing serious, or she would have said something. And like, it's also one of these things where you want to see the scene where they're confronted. That's good drama. That's an expectation you've been set up, is what's the scene gonna look like when this secret comes out, and it ends up nothing. Like Vanna is just like,
it was set up like a Chekhov's gun, kind of.
Yeah.
Then we get told that, oh, the gun wasn't loaded, but we don't get told why it wasn't loaded or what it means or anything. And it's like, okay. And since we have been in Cove's head, we also know that Cove isn't. She isn't
worried about this. It's not even like, oh, she's the hidden.
Yeah, and she isn't sociopathic enough to accept that, oh, Vanna is a bit sketch, but we're going to dive anyway because I need the money. No, we understand that Cove cares about these people, and she wouldn't do something if there was any question of Vanna being dangerous. So the whole thing just kind of diffuses. You're like, oh, Vanna's okay. And you're happy because you like Vanna. But at the same time, why did we do this then?
And we'll find out why, and it's a dumb reason at the end. I will say that that's kind of the problem, is it almost feels like the author wanted to be like, okay, the unhinged producer pushing it past the boundaries of safety, that's a stereotype, I'm going to subvert it. But the problem is that that stereotype exists because it adds a lot of tension. So Cove can't really add the tension that an unhinged producer would have if we're in her viewpoint and she's being reasonable. And it's not really subverted, it's just not there, and so you're never really scared because she's always making very good decisions about when they should come back for air and when they shouldn't.
Yeah, she's kind, she's conscientious, she gives everyone a choice always, because before going back down that evening before, actually, after the dive, they have this kind of discussion where she says that I can't make you go back down there now that we know that there are bodies. Because Hesty says that if there is one body in this preserved condition, and we haven't really seen any signs that the ship was evacuated before it sank, it's likely that we're going to find more bodies. So at that point, Cove says, like, I can't make you dive again now that we know what's down there. But there's a big risk that Vivitech is not going to pay us if we abort the mission now. So you're all going to have to choose for yourselves if you want to keep going.
Like, okay, she's a good person, affirmative consent, but that's not unrattling or unhinged. Before we get into the next dive, though, let's talk a little bit about the 1928 plotline. That one stars a character called...
Well, there is actually 3 characters in the 1928, but the main point of view that we get most of the time is Harland. He is deck crew.
And he is basically the most bland character you will ever meet, with no real interiority. And his thing is that basically he does his watch and then on the deck, and then he goes home or whatever, goes to his bunk, and like creepy shit keeps happening. They've been in this fog for a while now, and the fog is like tastes bad.
Yeah, it starts with him seeing his friend, the cargo officer.
Yeah.
Cargo officer. He is in one of the hallways and he is just staring at the wall with this weird glazed over eye kind of look. And Harlan's like, Fitz, what are you doing up here? Because usually Fitz stays down in the hold, but now he's up on the passenger decks. He's like, Fitz, what are you doing? And Fitz just stares at the wall and he goes, do you hear them? And he's like, just return down, Fitz. Go back to your job. You're not supposed to be here. Go. Mm-hmm. And Harlan thinks to himself that, I don't really have the authority to tell Fitz to go back down and do his job because I'm just a deck person. But Fitz kind of snaps back to it and just returns to his post. And Harlan stays in the hallway and he just stays there and he listens. And he's like, first I thought it was nothing. But then there was this sound, this scratching. And then the chapter breaks. And that's the first chapter we get in the past storyline.
And I was like, okay, this is cool.
Yeah, kind of.
I was like, okay, this is a good introduction. This is kind of creepy. The problem that will happen is that the author reveals things in the 1928 plot line, and then a chapter later has the dive team discover them on the ship. And that's just such a weird decision because it destroys the tension of them finding the thing because you just read about how it happened. There's no mystery now. It's like they find at one point that there's a bunch of shrouded bodies in one of the furnace rooms or something like that. But we had just learned previously why they were keeping the bodies there. So there's no real like mystery to it.
Yeah, you would imagine the two POVs to kind of sort of chase each other and not give too many clear answers. So you kind of just build more and more tension. But instead, the past points of view tended to give you just tell a lot of information to you, like, oh, this happened. And then in the next chapter, we see the dive crew go to that place in the ship and see the result of what we saw in the previous chapter. And it kind of saps all the tension because during the second dive, they go down to the cargo hold. Cove and Roy and Aiden go down to the cargo hold. and they end up in a bit of trouble. Aiden knocks something over and the room gets all filled with silt, so they basically can't see anything. It's a whiteout, except it's a undersea.
A silt out.
And Aiden's like, something is holding on to my ankle. Is that you, Vanna? Because they had called for Vanna to come and help them. And she's like, no, we're still on the second floor. And Aiden just panics.
This is the most creepy part of the modern day storyline to me, because it really played into the horror of being underwater. Because what happens is Roy ends up shouting, and that kind of destroys the comms. And so all of a sudden you have all these people who can't see each other, who can't hear each other. They can't communicate anymore.
They've knocked cargo over. They're trapped. They can't even see each other. They don't know what's up, what is down. Aiden is just panicking the freak out because something has grabbed onto him. So he's like tearing at his two mates, and he's like, there's this danger of him like tearing their masks off and them drowning, and there's just this complete sensory deprivation that's really tense. And you're like, oh, this is so terrifying.
We get into Hesty's point of view, and she like is trying to work with Vanna to get through the ship, but they can't talk to each other, so they make hand signals. And this is the part where I would have liked if we hadn't had the tension dissolved with Vanna, because it could have been like a very cool, like, I can't really trust this person that's going through the ship with me. What do they want? And the thing is, they're just these faceless like specters almost that are like kind of inhuman. And I was like, okay, this is it. This is going to be good.
And Vanna is muted enough, like her body language is very muted. She barely speaks. So she could be kind of creepy to Hesty, especially if we at that point don't trust Vanna. We haven't been given a single reason to think that she hasn't come here with ulterior motives.
And it was really cool, because again, this is the part that gets closest to that, you know, you're underwater, you're diving, and things went bad, and now you're stuck, and it's dark, and, you know, those very primeval horrors.
And Hesty and Vanna are trying to retrace their steps to come and get Cove and Roy and Aiden out of the hold. And when they start going towards them, Vanna realizes that their diving line that she has anchored to a rock outside the ship to give them a kind of a point of reference so they can always find their way out, that diving line has come loose or been cut for some reason.
And you're like, oh, who cut it?
Yeah, she's like, she asks the others, and this is before they get panicked in the hold, and all of them are like, we didn't touch your line, Vanna. You probably didn't tie it right. But you know also that Vanna is like, she is professional. She knows what she's doing. She would not tie a bad knot. So you're like, oh, who cut the line? And so they try to retrace their steps to find their point of entry, and by that means find the hold. And so they traced their steps back to the hallway that they came in through, and they left the door to the cabin that they entered through open. But when they come down the hallway, Hesty realizes that all the doors are closed. So they don't know where they entered. They don't know if they're in the right hallway.
Yeah.
And the ship is so deep underwater, everything is just pitch black, and their headlights they have on their masks only lights up a couple of feet in front of them.
And here's what I thought was going to happen in the book, and I kind of assumed this was going to happen, is that they get stuck. This is the rest of the book, is them underwater being like, oh shit, we don't have enough air. We can't get out of here fast enough. What are we going to do? Like, you know, like they're stuck there. And I thought that would have been such a good, like, structure for the book.
I was ready to sweat because drowning is just one of those really relatable things to be afraid of. Like, have you ever thought you were about to drown? If you have, you know how scary it is to just need air and not be able to have it. So that I was ready to sweat it out. Like, oh, are they going to make it out of the ship? How much air do they have left? Why are the doors closed? And it was really tense. And it was also in Hesty's point of view. And she still doesn't like trust Vanna entirely, even though we already know that Vanna is okay. But Hesty doesn't truly know. So Hesty is kind of scared, and she's kind of turning around like, where are we? And and she thinks she sees a shape down the corridor, and she's like, what is that? But then Vanna turns around and there's nothing there.
It's good stuff. It's very it's very good in that respect. What happens is that she stumbles onto the hospital area, and the hospital area has a bunch of people tied down to chairs, and it's talked about like, oh, what would it be like being stuck on these beds tied down as the ship sinks, because this is a thing they kind of did for a while or something like that.
With 3 leather straps over their bodies. And in the 18th century, it was quite common to strap passengers down to the beds when there was storms, just so they would not hurt themselves, because boats weren't as steady back then as they are today. But people realize that, that is really shitty if the boat sinks, because, how do you get loose? So that practice has been abolished, but she enters the hospital wing, and there's just bed after bed after bed of people being strapped down to their beds. And she was like, were they alive when the ship sank? Were they just lying here as the water started filling up the hospital bay, just waiting and waiting and waiting to be rescued? Like, well, what did they think when the water started coming over their faces and they realized that no one was coming to rescue them? That was really good. I get chills thinking about it.
And that's the thing, is the idea of it is almost scarier than the experience of it in the book, which is kind of a problem. So a while ago, we read World War Z, and one of the one of the stories in that book, because it's an anthology about like zombies, right, is these people who have to go kill these underwater hordes of zombies, and it's not even really a battle. It's just like this bizarre experience where zombies come at them and they use their diving claws just to like crush their heads one by one, but like the disorientation, and it's really weird. And they say like the biggest problem is just confusion, because all through the gloom you just see these waves of humans one by one, and like that's the thing where the distance point of view makes you go like, oh holy shit, I actually am getting chills talking about it. And that's one of those things the book did actually very well. I had problems with that book, but there were moments or like they would talk about, not specifically horror, but the people who had to listen to the radios of people dying, how they all committed suicide afterwards because it was such a horrific thing, and you are left with that feeling of, oh my God. Or like Korea, where they're like, there's probably an underground empire of the dead. And so like that's a place where being distance can really help. And this is a part in the book where because you kind of get the distance of it, you're like, okay, this is really scary. And again, it's tying into those fears of the deep, of drowning in the dark.
So it's a very human fear.
It really is.
It's closer to you as a person, as a reader. Like you can imagine how scared you would be if you were in that situation.
Just thinking about it is creepy. And so I keep wanting to call her Hestia. Hestia turns around and she sees Vanna floating towards her with her arms outstretched. Cut to black. And I was like, okay, not bad so far. This is good. We're going to see some movement on the Vanna storyline.
And meanwhile, the other guys have found their way out of the hold. They kind of find a wall and they creep along the wall until they happen upon a door. So they kind of get out, and Aiden still thinks that something grabbed him, but Cove just thinks that he got his ankle stuck on a rope, which is the most likely explanation, right?
Communications come back and Vanna's like, oh, something grabbed her. And you're like, oh shit, is Vanna lying? Is she not? And they eventually get out. I don't think they really run into any more problems.
No, they trace, since communication is back up, they hear that the guys are in the hospital wing, and Cove has kind of memorized the layout of the ship, so she knows how to get them to the hospital wing. On the way there, Roy kind of peeks into another one of the cargo holds, and they follow him in. And at that point, they see that someone has torn off the plates on the back wall of the cargo hold, because this was one of the old unsinkable ships of the Titanic era that had one hard outer hull, and then they had an inner hold, and in between there were compartments of air, and the idea was that if the outer hold was breached, the inner hold would keep the water out and keep the boat floating. But they see that someone has just worked and torn off the panels and just broken big holes into the walls. And this would have been really cool and kind of a bit of a conundrum for you as the reader. You're like, why would someone do that? If not for the fact that in the previous chapter, in the past, we just saw why someone broke the hold open.
The stock guy basically had taken a pickaxe or a wrench or whatever to the wall and said, like, they're inside. We have to get them.
Fitzwilliam is convinced that there are bodies in the wall, so he sort of just hacks his way through.
And I actually kind of liked, again, I like conceptually a lot of things in the 1928 plot line, because what happens is people come around and you see the captain and his 4 officers are with him, and you think, okay, he's going to stop Fitzwilliam, but instead he goes, continue. And you're like, oh, shit.
Yeah, let's see what's in there. You're like, what?
And they find a body curled up. And the idea was that earlier Fitzwilliam had said that like some dock workers had died making the ship, because that's just very normal. And so the idea is that like they fell into the wall, and like they were stuck there the whole time, and they bring this guy out, but some of his skin stays peeled to the plating. And I was like, this is fucking cool.
Yeah, he has fallen down in the pocket between the walls, and he has been there just slowly mummifying until he's kind of fused with the outer hull, and they kind of just peel him off.
Oh, and I was like, okay, this is pretty cool. But again, it's cool, but then you lose the tension of them finding it in the present day plot line. So it's like, why did the two aren't working in concert with each other?
The plot lines, they kind of step on each other instead of chase each other. So one plot line spoils the next plot line. In some ways, I feel like independently, both of these books could have worked, but when they're in the same book, it's one of the reasons why, in the end, I didn't love this book.
And I think the thing is that the 1928 plotline feels like the author needed to know what happened on the ship, so as a writing exercise, they wrote it out through in a kind of summary way by one of the night watchmen or whatever. And then they were like, but what if I just publish this part without editing it? And that's what they did.
Yeah. Or like an editor looked at her bullet notes and they were like, oh, you have to put this in the book. People want to see why this happened. And she was like, but I can't really be asked writing all these scenes out. So a lot of the past scenes are kind of more summarized, and there's a lot more telling in those sequences, which also doesn't really heighten the tension of what is happening. Things get introduced in a kind of flippant way, just stating facts like, oh, the fog was driving them crazy. And at that point, I was like, what fog? Have I missed something? What is this fog? Why does it stink? So I had to retrace, and I hadn't missed the part where they introduced the fog. Suddenly the fog was just there.
The reason that scene with pulling the guy out of the wall is effective is because it's an actual scene. We saw it happen, and there was build up to it.
Yeah, and there's this weirdness of Fitzwilliam being supposed to lead the passengers to the dining hall, because at that point, weird things are happening on the ship. People are going missing. People are not acting right. So they have kind of put this schedule where no one walks the ship's halls unaccompanied. So they lead the passengers to the dining room to have their dinner, and then leads them back to the cabins so that everyone can stay safe. But instead of taking them to the dining hall, he takes them down into the hold. So that is another layer of what is happening? Why is everyone drawn to this room? And why? How did Fitz know there was a body in the wall? And it's just kind of creepy, and one of the better scenes because it's actually happening on page.
And I think that's a real weakness with the book, is that they step on each other and they're not scenes. So back to the dive crew.
Yeah, they find the holes in the inner walls, and Cove kind of draws attention to it, and they're like, what happened here? Were they doing repairs? And internally Cove is like, no, they would not have done it this way. But let's just distract Roy, because she has noticed that there are sacks on the floors, and they kind of just pass them by. But she has realized that in the sacks there are dead bodies. And since Roy reacted so badly to the last dead body, she's like, let's not make him focus on it, because Roy cannot contain his emotions. He just acts out whatever he's feeling right there and then. So she tries to distract him while Aiden is just staring at the bodies. And he's like, did one of them move? he thinks one of their hands moved, but he isn't sure. So they leave the hold, and then they find Vanna and Hesty in the hospital wing.
Yeah, and they haven't really moved because Hesty is having a seizure, essentially. And they're like, oh shit, that's not good. She wouldn't have had one before this because you can't go diving if you get seizures. And then they basically, there's some stuff where like they have to figure out how to get out of the ship by going through different like tunnels and stuff. And I think this is where something like the book is not bad, but it could be stronger here. So if you've read any Michael Crichton books, that one. Specifically, we read Jurassic Park. His scenes are so tension-filled because it's like every little thing the characters do have consequences. You get in, the raptors are going to do this. They're going to do this. When they do this very small movement, they get, the raptors do this in response, and like he's just very good at that. And it's interesting because his characters are even more distant than these characters are from us, but there's still a lot of tension there. And in this case, it's a lot of like just logistics of like foot A goes in rung B kind of a description of what's happening, and we'll get to how that's even more of a problem later. But they get back to the surface, and like Sean is a dick and is like, guys,
he's like, oh, Hesty was with Vanna when she had her seizure. What did Vanna do?
And you guys don't know this, but I showed her a journal with some creepy shit in it. And also, she's bankrupt. That's why she's pushing all of you guys unfairly. And as a reader, you really are like, what?
You're like, what the fuck are you smoking, dude? And at that point, I was just like, Sean is such a bitch. I hate him. He is so... like a little boy who is angry because his toys stopped working, so he's just gonna make the trip miserable for everyone else.
He's just gonna make it everybody else's problem.
Yeah, and the fact that Cove is so adamant that Vanna is okay, and you as the reader already know that Vanna is okay, his behavior just stands out as even more childish and annoying. Even though if you do extend him some sympathy, his reaction is kind of valid because he doesn't know what Cove and Vanna talked about, and the diary was a bit disturbing.
That should have made him suspect Cove a lot more, and then there could have been... And this is the other problem. Nothing comes of this. Like,
no.
He reveals the secret, the Chekhov's gun goes off, and it's a whimper. Like, nothing really comes of it. These actions don't have repercussions. It's not like Vanna is now out on the last dive and they can't...
No. And Roy and Sean don't like each other. They distrust each other. And for some reason, Roy just latches on to Sean's gossiping. He's like, oh, but Vanna is sus, man. Vanna is sus. I don't want to be with Vanna for the next dive. And it struck me as a little odd that Roy would bank in on what Sean is saying when Roy obviously doesn't really respect Sean much.
It is weird. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's because it's kind of just there to add tension. There's not really these personalities really affecting each other in an organic way to create tension.
No, and it made me like Roy even less.
Which he's already a man, so even farther. One of the people we haven't really mentioned a lot is called Devereaux. He's a rich guy who owns the ship who wishes he could dive, but he can't.
He's an historian as well, and that is why he's on this trip. He's a historian. He has been obsessed with shipwrecks since he was a little boy. He's been dreaming of them this whole life. He likes the mystery of them, and pretty much all of the mysteries he grew up with have been sort of either explained or debunked at this time. Arcadia is one of those lost golden myths, so he was kind of desperate to go see it on this first dive. And he is wealthy and he had a boat, so he just put out a really good offer for the crew to jump on. So he has this really nice, luxurious boat that they got to ride on for cheaps. And that is basically why he's here.
And he hasn't really interacted much with anybody. And he also isn't creepy. And this is a problem with the book, which is the book should have made him much creepier. There should have been more creepy stuff on the surface of the ship because there really isn't. Like, oh, why is Devereaux doing this? Like, he's kind of an odd fellow. He seems to know more about this wreck than they do. Like, that would have been like a very cool tension to have. Especially because at this point, he goes to Aiden and is like, I need you to do something for me. You want to be famous, don't you, buddy? And we don't figure out what he wants him to do, but you're like, oh, more tension. And this is going to be again, a Chekhov's gun that just is like a water gun.
No, it was a bit too throwaway, everything. Like, she didn't build it enough to make me think that he had any other ulterior motives than just being, a sort of fleece, cozy, older professor dude who just loved mysteries.
I would have liked him to be more, but that is really all he really is. And so that's one of the reasons even that tension feels kind of muted before you figure out that there's going to be nothing tension-wise there. And basically, they're like, Cove is like, okay, guys, I won't make you guys dive in if you don't want to. Affirmative consent. And Aiden and Roy are both like, we're down, we're game. And like, this really should have been, because the thing is they need to get a certain amount of footage, and if there's 4 people, they get more footage.
Yeah, and also Sean reveals that Cove is bankrupt, and she tells them the story that she bankrupted herself for her dad, and then he died anyway. So we get this sense that Roy and Sean, they're like, okay, solidarity instead of being divided like Sean wanted. But also, obviously, Hesty can't go back diving now since she's had a seizure. So she has to stay on the ship.
She wakes up. We don't get like the lingering tension of, oh, maybe Vanna did something to her. We're not going to know till the end of the book when she wakes up. No, she wakes up and is like, yeah, I had a seizure. The thing seemed like it grabbed me. Like that was, again, such a missed opportunity for some tension.
It's really a book of missed opportunities, at least in the horror spectrum.
Again, as a mystery, it works okay at points. So they're going to go dive again. Vanna's going to come with them. But before that, going back to the 1928 plot line, some creepy stuff is continuing to happen. Okay, so he's on watch and a guy commits killing himself, because this is YouTube, and jumps off the side of the ship. Nobody can figure out why. And then the next day,
his wife jumps off. And a few days later, Harland is on watch on deck. He's cold, he's freezing. And he hears like the creaking, and he thinks they are shifting people in the crow's nest, because these ships had crow's nests. So he thinks there's a new crewmate climbing into the crow's nest to take shift. And then he just hears something heavy hit the deck and a hard crack. And in the distance, through the fog, he sees that there's a person lying broken on the deck. And he just approaches it to kind of look at what happened, Jesus. And then there's another thunk, and another body hits the deck, and then another one. And lots of these passengers have been missing at that point. And now, for some reason, they're just climbing up to the crow's nest, and then they keep going, just suicide, jumping off the mast and down onto the deck, just breaking against the floor. And that scene as well, I felt would have been so creepy if the author just kind of, if she was a cameraman, we just imagine her kind of, the camera just zooming in closer and closer and closer.
As you hear thumps. And that's the thing, is that conceptually, this is a very creepy scene. But in execution, Harland is like a little too distant for you, and there's not enough like sensory details.
Yeah, he's just standing there looking at it, and he doesn't really react to what is happening. We don't get any kind of, we don't really sense him being horrified at what is happening. He's just, oh well, okay. Oh, there's another one.
At this point, there's another scene with Fitzwilliam where Fitzwilliam has gone back to the hold. He's gaunt. There's a nice description of how his hands are basically like tendons and bone that are wrapped. And he is, I think he's still hitting the wall.
Yeah. He just keeps breaking open new entries in the wall, because he's like, there's more of them. I can hear them scratching at the walls.
And the captain comes up, and the captain is there with his guys, and he goes like, Fitzwilliam has taken something from the ship, so he must give it back. Put him on the wall, he says to like his like older staff or whatever.
Oh yeah, because what has been happening is that Fitz, he thinks there's more bodies behind the wall, so he's been digging and trying to break through where he made the first breach, where they found the first body. So he has actually breached the hull. There is seawater coming into the hull. And the captain's like, oh, it's a good thing Fitzwilliam is here. Like, he discovered this weakness in the ship, and now he's going to help us fix it. Put him in the wall. So the crewmates kind of just gang up on Fitzwilliam, and they kind of shove him into the hole in the outer hull, as if he was a cork.
and this worked for me because it's from Harlan's point of view and he doesn't move. I would have liked more horror of him realizing he's weak and not going to move and stop this thing from happening.
Yeah.
But it leaves you, it does that cut to black thing. And I was like, oh, okay, this is cool. This is a really creepy scene.
It would have been even more effective if he was horrified at what is happening, but he also feels like he can't react because he is at this point afraid of his fellow passengers. That would have heightened the tension even more from just this weird thing happening. But you're like, what the fuck are they doing?
The thing is also, after this point, he also mentions how, oh man, people now are going into the walls. They're burrowing into the walls. We don't know how many people are doing it anymore. We're running out of light. We're having to use candles from the hold.
Yeah, they have to check the cabins because passengers keep vanishing, and they do checks every day of sections of the ship. And a lot of the time they find that passengers have just made holes in the wall and just contorted themselves and crawled inside out of terror for something.
Or some kind of fascination or something, or they really don't know why. And the thing about it is that the way this whole plot line should have been structured is that slowly Harlan is falling into this madness as well. So he almost understands why people are going into the walls, but not quite. That's how it should be structured. He's slowly falling into this madness as well, just slower than the people who are actually going into the walls, because he's going around with a guy he likes to check the holds, and he goes into a room to find a thing, and the guy had stayed outside, and when he comes back out, the guy is in the wall. And he just takes his candle from him and goes, I'm sorry, and he leaves. And I would have liked a lot more of like a, oh, I almost understand why he did this, or like, I can't do this yet, but how comforting would it be to be within the walls? You know, something like that. Something that really got you into like the psychological horror of it.
Yeah, like I told you, I sent William saying that this author really should have channeled the energy of Uzumaki, if you know what that is.
Yes.
It's a famous manga that is all about a small town being affected by spirals. People become absolutely obsessed with spirals, and then crazy shit starts to happen. And that book really knows how to really just kind of pause and just zoom in on reality warping, people losing their minds, and then just really visceral body horror that should be a bit ridiculous, like people are folding themselves into walls, but it's really gross and scary at the same time. If the scene could have done that and just played more with perception warping, that would have been such a cool scene. Like you're with this guy, you guys are doing a job, and suddenly he just tunes out and goes full crab. At that point, I was thinking that the passengers they are being possessed by the crustacean god, and they're just trying to find a little house to burrow in.
The hermit crab disease.
Yeah.
I'll talk about what I wanted the mystery to finally end up as closer to the end, but I think there's a way to make this kind of burrowing. And the other thing about it is it's like, it's not really a thing you've seen before. It's like, this is just a weird compulsion. Like, you don't really see this in horror movies. And so because of its weirdness and strangeness, it really has like a weight, a creepiness and a mystery to it. And then for some reason, because the author wanted to have a couple of scenes, we're shoved into another point of view, which should have just been this guy's point of view the whole time. And then in the past storyline, where the guy who stands by the captain's door.
Yeah, we get Third Officer Swain's point of view. And Third Officer Swain is on his first tour with the SS Arcadia, and he seems to be a lot less affected by this than a lot of the other people are. So he is like, we have to get help. Why is the captain just locking himself into his cabin and not letting anyone use the radio? We need to send a distress call. So he kind of creeps around and waits for the captain to do his daily thing where he leaves the cabin. And when the captain is gone, he breaks into he breaks into the place.
The bridge.
He has a key for some reason. Yeah, into the bridge. Yeah. Sorry, I'm not English. He breaks into the bridge. He has a key for some reason. Maybe it's because he's the third officer. I don't actually know.
He doesn't have a key, I don't think. I think he picks the lock, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah, maybe he picks the lock. Anyway, he gets
Yeah, I think I
inside
said that.
and he starts sending out distress calls on like every frequency. There were only like 4 frequencies back then. So he sends one on each, like pan pan, pan pan, which is an international distress call, not as severe as Mayday. Mayday is like, we are sinking, we need help now or people are going to die. Pan pan is a distress call, like something we need aid, but it's not pressing. And when he finally gets in contact with someone, they're like, what is your location? And he's like, I don't know. So he gives them coordinates and coordinates and coordinates. And he's like, I don't know where we are. You have to come help us. Pan, pan. And then he's like,
And it's like,
there's bodies. There's bodies coming out of the walls. And that is the scene the book opened with. We realize at that point.
which I think is my theory for why she didn't just have these 2 POVs but 1 POV all along, is she didn't want you to recognize the name or something like that. But it's not. I didn't care. It just didn't. The tension for me there didn't work. I just don't. They're both equally bland characters. It just, to suddenly introduce a POV just to do this thing shows the author's hand a little bit in a way that I find counterproductive.
And in the past scenes, we only ever find out the surnames of the people. So we only know that Swain is Swain. We don't really know him as a person, which makes the fact that there are 2 different point of view characters, it's kind of hard to notice the difference between them if you're not paying very close attention.
Yeah, if you weren't paying attention, you would not have really noticed. And then there's another scene with him after a few more chapters where he decides he's going to go back in and he's going to go back in there, and I forget what he's going to do, but he's going to go back in there and talk to
He's going to send another distress call. He thinks he knows their location now.
And he goes in, but there's no light and he can't see. So he goes and suddenly a light turns on when he's looking for a match. And in the chair the whole time has been the captain. And the captain just turns around and looks at him. And says some creepy shit, and then jumps to attack him. And the guy, I already forgot his name,
Swain,
he kills him, but he doesn't remember doing it as he leaves the cabin.
Yeah, he kind of blacks out.
And then there's another scene where after this, where Harland is gathered in front of the entire crew, and one of the, I don't know, staff sergeants or something is like, the captain has made these decisions for the best of the crew, and the captain is in his chair but hasn't turned around. And then he turns around and it's just the captain, like his dead body tied to the chair. And I thought that was a really cool idea, even if it's not in execution necessarily the creepiest. What does the captain say that they're going to do, or the officer? What was their plan? I forget.
A man goes around just summoning the crew, like, come to the bridge. The captain has a message for you, everyone. So they go up to the bridge, and the first mate stand next to the captain's chair, and the captain is sitting in the chair. And slowly the mate pivots the chair around, and the captain's corpse is strapped to the chair, and he's holding a kind of a bulb of something, a jar or something in his hands. And they're like, oh my god, he's dead. Because Harlan didn't know the captain was dead up until that point. Like, no one had seen the captain for a few days, but everyone just assumed he'd gone even more kooky. But then it's like, oh, he's dead. But then it's like, but wait. And the mate's like, listen to your captain. He has a message. He has orders for all of you. And they're like, oh, look, is the corpse? He's saying something.
Yeah.
And the mate is like, the captain gives you the orders to, you have to find the people in the walls. There are bodies in the walls. You have to keep digging until you get all of them out. That is your captain's orders. Listen to him.
Yeah, and I like that. It's creepy and it's unhinged, and it's like now But the thing is, I didn't really quite understand the logic of what was going on, and we'll talk about that more as we go. Okay, so back to the present, we have the third dive. In the third dive, they get down there. Cove notices that whenever her rebreather releases oxygen, like, there's like a weird creaking in the ship and weird stuff happens.
Oh, and they are splitting up again because they need to split into teams to get the hours of footage they need for Vivitech. So they split with Vanna and Aiden going to the smoking room on the first floor. And Roy and Cove are going. Where were they going?
I actually don't remember.
They were going down into the lower levels. And Cove
Yes.
decided to go down there because she thinks it's her responsibility to do the most dangerous job. She wants Aiden to be safe. So she and Roy tries to go down to the lower levels and examine some places they haven't been before.
Basically, I don't think anything really important happens until zombies awaken on the ship. And all of the bodies start to move and try to go after them. And there are all these like zombie mummy creatures.
Yeah, somehow Roy and Vanna I think they end up in the captain's old cabin or something, because they find a log where all the passengers' names are listed, and a lot of them just deceased, missing, burrowing sickness, deceased. And at that point, they're like, what the fuck happened on this ship? And at that point, Cove's point of view starts telling you that there's a weird creaking in the ship. And it's almost like it's following them.
The zombie thing happens. Here's the thing. Water zombies is such a lame way to reveal what was going on the ship. It's so, like, they're literally just water zombies. That's not really very scary. I had expected something so much creepier from the ship itself, or, you know, the, I didn't even necessarily need a monster. Again, I feel like them being trapped underwater in this ship would have been so much creepier than being chased by a bunch of water zombies, essentially. This will take up a good, like, hour of the audiobook of them just, like, playing hide and seek with water zombies.
Yeah, and I thought that was the, what's it called? The climax. I fully expected this to be the climax. I was like, this is where they're gonna fight the water zombies, try to get out of the ship, and some of them are probably not going to make it, and we're going to have to watch them drown, and it's going to be really tense and horrible.
I also thought that's what was going to happen, because again, it's the sense of claustrophobia. I was like, okay, we didn't get stuck in this ship the whole time, but now we're stuck, and there's going to be all these things about oxygen and, like, you know, the cold calculations of, like, oh, if one of us gives the other person oxygen, then we'll have more, you know, that whole thing.
And very quickly we end up in the situation where showing the monster just kind of takes away some of that power that the monster had.
It's such a lame explanation. Like, and we'll find out later that basically what it is that, like, there was some kind of, like, a virus on some grain that got on the ship, but maybe also it was maybe a curse.
No. The explanation,
close.
No. The explanation is that a company called JP, it stands for a name I can't remember, J Parker maybe, had come up with a new fabric softener that made cotton more comfortable to wear. It was softer on the skin. But the downside was that when the fabric got wet, it released a neurotoxin that caused disorientation, it caused paranoia, it caused delusions. So when the fabric was stored in the hull and got moist, because the hull isn't heated up, it was too far from the furnaces, that neurotoxin started being released in the air and people started going wonky.
And so the idea, I think, is that, like, okay, so they don't really understand the science, but this is like some kind of bacteria disease, kind of, you know, that whole thing of zombies is, like, biologically plausible. And it's mentioned that, like, you know, the zombies, they don't want to kill them, they just want them to stay on the ship with them. Like, and they're kind of treated almost as like a hive mind.
We get a kind of non-explanation, because at first we get that explanation through Devereaux, because he had always suspected there to be, there was this fabric theory that JP had sent these clothes on the ship. So that was Devereaux's theory. And in order to prove this theory, he has sent Aiden down into the holds to collect a sample. So that is where Aiden and Vanna has been. They were supposed to be in the smoking room, but they have gone down into the hold. So that is the explanation to why the crew started going wonky, and the explanation to why Fitz, who was in charge of the hold, became wonky first, because he was closest to the fabric. But as the journey went on, old air was circulated throughout the ship by the vents. So the neurotoxin affected the entire crew. And the people who were up on deck were the last ones to be affected, while the people who were indoors were affected more early on. But Hesti also launches the idea that that isn't the entire explanation for the zombies, though. She was like, but what if there was already evil on the ship, and these were just two perfect storms meeting and releasing this evil caused by this body in the walls?
And you're like, okay, that's kind of interesting. Here's what I wanted. I wanted a couple of things. First of all, I wanted the captain to have been setting out for this specific sea for either for one of two reasons. Either he knew about this horror and knew that it could be stopped by being in a non-oxygenated area, or the monster wanted to be preserved, and that's why it was having him go to this special sea area. Because it's never really explained why he goes in this direction. It's just kind of like left there.
Yeah, it's just the neurotoxin made him disorientated.
I also wanted it to be like maybe not water zombies, but like maybe like there's actual flesh between the hulls of the ship, and that's what like almost like the ship has become the exoskeleton for some kind of like fleshy growth. I think that would have been kind of a cool idea. Or like maybe they find where that guy's skin had stayed on the hull and it's grown into like a carpet across the thing, like, you know, something more like The Thing, or like just biomechanical grossness,
like the mushroom people from The Last of Us.
Yes, exactly.
Like there's an organism that has spread throughout the ship and just used people, kind of infested their bodies.
Exactly, like as bio fuel, essentially. I think that would have been creepy. I also would have liked some more kind of a sense of consciousness from the ship, because the parts where the book is kind of creepy is where it's talking about how like the ship is hungry. You know, like the ship wants blood. I think that would have been, if it had kind of had like an eldritch consciousness of like, no, I want everything. I will keep you here. Like that kind of anthropomorphization or personification through, you know, like fleshy growth, I think would have been a really cool idea. But that's, I think the author tries to do it a little bit in that the zombies are, they kind of act like a hive mind, but I think if you don't have zombies, I think it becomes much creepier if the ship itself is keeping them from getting up to the surface. Like there's something where like you could get more of a fear of being in the crushing deep and not being able to get out than being chased by zombies. Like if that is the tension, is how do we get out of this ship that like maybe is closing doors or making, you know, changing around us or something like that, or trying to crush us, then we're being chased by zombies. And like it would have been cool to have a scene of like one of them who freaks out and like is like, fuck this, I'm going for the surface, and goes too fast and gets all those oxygen things exploded out of his body. Like that's a cool horror kill or death. And it would have helped be like, no, you can't get to the surface now. Like, you know, something like that. And I would have liked it too if Vanna had like this whole time, you know, the ship had been whispering to her or something like that. Or maybe like Devereaux had been able to go there once. Here he found some part of the ship, but his body wouldn't survive going down into the surface. So he brought this whole team there, and then he's on the radio and they find out that actually he's gone crazy and he's going to keep them there for the ship to eat. He was almost like a lure, because then you could have had his crazy voice in their earpieces the whole time. And there would have been a sense of like, oh, we can't get out. Like that, those are the things the book should capitalize on, instead of zombie chase, where it's just a very mechanical, we went here and did this and the zombies did that.
You want more of an eldritch feel to it. As if the thing has an influence that kind of expands. It has infused the ship, but it can also sort of expand and infuse and affect the people that are in the boat, and you know.
Because that would have had tension with the surface storyline, which isn't really there. I think that it also could have been a cool something where it's like, you know, Vanna wants to return because she wants to live forever with this creature. She wants, you know what I mean? Like it's trying to assimilate people, but it's really like, oh, I'm going to be assimilated and be with it forever or something like that.
That would also kind of tie into, because at this point I think we can reveal what has happened to Vanna.
And it's revealed in a flashback, the only flashback in a book from Cove's point of to Vanna and her having that conversation we didn't get to see. So annoying.
Yeah, Cove is having a flashback of her and Vanna talking about what was in her diary, and what happened was that Vanna was cave diving with her girlfriend and life partner, and the girlfriend
By the
got
way,
stuck in one of the passages and drowned. And as a way to process this grief, Vanna's therapist said that she should write down her dreams. So she is obviously dreaming of that time that the person she loved drowns. So that is the reason for the cryptic lines. Your idea could really vibe with what if Vanna, because the girlfriend is still in the sea, they have tried to retrieve the body, but it's stuck, so they haven't been able to. So she says, being in the sea kind of makes me feel connected to my love. And the eldritch horror that Will is imagining could kind of, play onto that and kind of
yeah,
make Vanna want to stay because she feels like there is connection.
with her dead girlfriend.
Yeah, co-opted by this creature.
And I think from a structure point of view, it's actually really cool because it's like, oh, you thought that tension was diffused, but this gave you information for the twist to come. Yeah, the reason she wrote this thing was because she was sad about her girlfriend, but being sad about her girlfriend means that she wants to stay forever with this creature.
And it would totally have subverted our expectations at that point, because by then we have realized that Vanna is a good person. She is responsible. She's going to save them. So it would really just have flipped it back around if this thing had exploited her wish to be with her fiance
her
again.
girlfriend. Which, by the way, like, this is one of those kill your gay tropes that, like, I don't know why she needed to be the one gay character. There's that trope about, like, if the gay characters are always losing their loved one, like their partners.
Oh yeah, it is a trope. I did get gay vibes of Vanna the entire time.
I thought she was explicitly gay because she said her partner, but you're right, it was probably her diving partner. I'm dumb. And so we're not going to talk about that. We're just
I think she said she and my love, so she is gay.
Oh,
and
okay,
I totally got that vibe off of her long before we found out that she's gay. And I don't really oppose that she is the gay person, but it's unfortunate that we have that trope, the kill your gays trope, and the fridging and all that.
And the thing is, this book is otherwise pretty allergic to dark things happening to its characters, so it's just weird that it was her specifically. Like, any of the other characters could have been gay. You could have just swapped it. There's no real reason.
It didn't feel malicious to me, but also I'm a cis straight person, so I'm not the one to comment on that. So if you have thoughts about it, write them down in the comments.
Val, you need to chime in. Court, you need to chime in. Tell us if Lindbergh needs to check her privilege at the door. I don't have that problem because I don't care. And so this is, again, about like an hour or two of them just playing hide and seek with zombies, and it's not really full of tension.
Vanna and Aiden has gone down into the hole because Devereaux gave Aiden this mission to collect a sample from one of the bags that he saw in the hole, because Devereaux had this fascination and this theory that JP Devereaux sent Aiden down to collect a sample from one of the sacks. So when shit really starts happening and the zombies start really being active, because they are activated by the oxygen released by their rebreathers, that's kind of a signal to them that there are living beings in the ship now, and they can get new friends to stay with them, I guess.
I hated that as a reason. Like, it just felt dumb.
So he and Vanna are down in one of the holes when shit starts going down. So they find themselves just surrounded by water zombies, and we get this really cramped sort of escape segment where they end up behind a line of crates, and there's like zombies coming at them from all directions. And at that point, I actually thought they weren't going to make it out.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be creepy and they were going to die. And
I liked them most out of all the characters. So I was like, no.
This book is very allergic to letting any of its characters die because, spoiler alert, none of them die. And it's like, what a lame horror movie. None of them even do the heroic sacrifice.
I mean,
somebody needed to go to the surface, and we needed to be in their POV feeling the carbon dioxide breaking their body apart. That would have been very cool, and we didn't get it.
I would like at least someone not to make it, and we would get this scene where they reminisce of what the price of this journey was. It was supposed to be just a cash grab, and instead they paid so much more than they had imagined.
And then in the epilogue, it goes to his point of view, and you see that this person has become part of the ship now and thinks in the ship, and the ship hungers.
That could be Vanna. I would have been very sad if Vanna didn't make it, because she was my favorite character. Cove and Roy figure out that these things are, the light hurts their eyes. So by shining their flashlights in their eyes, they can make the zombies, which are basically just sunken, reanimated bodies. And that's the reason for the cracking, because their joint cartilage has gone stiff from all the years. So when they move, there's this sound, which is another detail that would work so much better in a movie, because you would have that audio to also heighten the experience. Like, a lot of this would work so much better as a movie, because you would get rid of the telling issue that the past sequences has. And a lot of the horror is in the visuals.
And the other thing is, it's actually a really good excuse to keep the camera rolling once terrible things happen, which is they have cameras on their suits. So like, you don't even need to worry about the whole idea of why do.
And you could cash in on that limited peripheral view. Like, even they only have this field of view underwater. You could also cash in on their how little they actually see ahead of them, even when there's not a silt out, which would also heighten the emotion.
It's a thing where the book doesn't play to the few strengths, or the strengths that literature has, or prose have, over the visual medium.
But somehow both of them manage to get back into larger open spaces, and Aiden's suit gets ripped, but Vanna helps him kind of clamp his hand on it to keep most of the water out. At that point, their communication has broken again. Like, there is some weird thing disrupting their communications, like a signal or something. So they are kind of isolated. They're communicating through hand signals. And the things grab onto Aiden and start dragging him down. And we think he tries to, because Vanna has tied them together so they could navigate even if there was a salt out. And we think that he's going to die now. He tries to cut himself loose from her to save her. But they manage to escape. And at the same time, Roy and Cove has been kind of, because they start to escape, and there's like bodies coming out of the cabins from all sides, and they're kind of just speeding through the tunnels trying to make it back to the dining hall, because they can float up through the ceiling that is just glass and several of the panes are broken. But when they get there are zombies blocking the exit, so they turn and they see that the only way they can go is further down into the heart of the ship. And as they're sort of speeding down, Cove is like, oh, they're leading us here. We're like rats in a trap. They're just leading us to the heart of... And at that point, she's like, we're not going to make it out, are we? And at that point, we also see Aiden and Vanna breaking free. She inflates their buoyancy bags, so she kind of just rips Aiden out of their grip, and they rise to the ceiling.
And that's about it. Here's one thing I was very disappointed by, because in the 1928 timeline, it ends with Harlan just being like, the ship's going down, and I found a place in the wall, and I sat there, right? And like, this should have, again, been the culmination of him finally, like, we as the reader, and he understands why he goes into the wall and burrows in there. And then I thought it was going to be a thing where, like, they found him in the modern timeline, but didn't realize who it was, or like, he saved them somehow, or like, there was some kind of a connection there. But it really is just like, oh, I need this plot line to end now that it's given me all the exposition I wanted. So he went into the wall. Like, it should have tied back somehow.
The past people never really felt like true characters. Like Swain, after he has that altercation with the captain, he just thinks he's gonna go back to his cabin and not come out for a really long time, and that's how he loses track of him. And Fitz is shoved in the wall, so he's obviously not doing so great. And Harlan at one point just thinks that he's going to find a nice place to burrow.
It's one of the ways the book is very weak, and just doesn't. It doesn't. It could be better. It could be so much better. And then basically, yeah, they Cove and Roy also get to the surface again, doing stuff.
Cove and Roy go to the heart of the ship, and they end up in this huge hold space that is just empty. And then they look down, and at the bottom, it's just a sea of writhing, pale, bloated bodies, just tons and tons of zombies, just sort of reaching out their hands to them. And the Cove is like, Roy, we're not gonna make it. And she's like, if it had to end this way, I'm glad it was with you. And Roy's like, yeah, me too, girl. And at that point, I was like, I forgive Roy. He's a great guy.
He's going to sacrifice from himself for her.
He's so sweet. And then they find another door and they kind of lock themselves in and they're like, oh, at least we staved off the zombies for now. And then she realizes that they are in the... I'm not sure if it was Fitz. At first, I thought it was Fitz, but...
Yeah, no, I thought it was going to come back to play, but they're down in the pools in the locker, and it's like none of the characters went there or anything, so I'm not really sure why.
At first, I thought they had accidentally entered the hold and found Fitz shoved in the wall and realized that, oh, there's a breach to the outside. If we just kind of crush him and mash him up, we can get out. But I don't think that was cool. Actually who they found. I think it was just another passenger who had kind of carved a hole in the hull.
Yeah, I think it was just some random zombie.
Yeah, that they mash up. And at that point, Roy is like, oh, I'm too big to fit through this hole, Cove. You go first. And we're like, oh, he's going to sacrifice himself. He's a nice guy, actually. But she's like, no, Roy, you go first. I'm boss. You go first. If you don't make it, we're not going to make it. And you're like, oh, they're both going to die then because he's too big for that hole. But no, he makes it out. And she's like, oh, we don't have enough oxygen to reach the surface to do the decompression schedule. And you're like, oh, fuck. But at that point, we already know that Vanna has left spare oxygen over on the ocean bed. So I'm like, just go get the spare oxygen, dummies.
You'll be fine.
And then Cove is like, oh, there's spare oxygen. Let's go get it. And they find the oxygen tanks and they're like, oh, Aiden and Vanna aren't here. But we already know that they are going to make it out as well. So it's just like, just wait a minute, dummies. They're going to come. And then they do. And you're like, okay.
And they're like, Aiden's suffocating because his mask got off at one point.
Well, he's freezing. He has water in his suit. So his body temperature is dangerously low and his oxygen is really low as well. But him and Vanna share a tube because his body temperature is so low. Like, the narrative doesn't actually tell us this, but because his body temperature is so low, he consumes less oxygen. So they can share a tube, and then they rush the decompression schedule to reach the surface in just an hour and 20 minutes as opposed to 2 hours. Whereas Roy and Cove, they have one oxygen tube each, so they can do the full decompression thing. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I also expected Vanna and Aiden
to make out,
to get decompression sickness. Mm-hmm. Why would they make out? Well, why?
You said that you expected them to, and I was like, make out. Me too, but I guess not.
We know we're brain jumped.
There's so much tension in making the getting up there like so long, right? Initially, I thought. But actually, how it functions in the book is to diffuse tension because it's just like, oh, and then we just sat around for 2 hours, like, waiting to get up. Like, there's a point after the second dive where they're like, there was a dead body. And she's like, no, we'll talk about it once we get on the ship. So they've just been hanging out for 2 hours thinking about like, it really robs it of a lot of immediacy. It's kind of like if there was, like, a walk and talk where it just robs it a lot of the immediacy.
Yeah, and they just make it back up onto the boat.
And Hestia is like, not Hestia, Hessie is like, oh, the ship, it wants us to stay. I can hear it calling a little bit. And you're like, ooh. And you find out that the thing Deborah wanted was just a sample of the cloth to figure it out. And you're like, that's lame. Why was that not an evil
a bit dumb.
thing?
And Sean is like, it was Vanna. Vanna did something bad, didn't she? Because he just can't let it go. And Cove is like, no, there are zombies. And Roy is like, yeah, there's actually zombies. And Sean is like, stop yanking my chain, dudes. It's not funny anymore. So they're like, just look at our footage, dude. Just look at our footage, Sean. Stop being a bitch.
It's so lame that they have footage of zombies.
So he does.
Yeah, and he looks and he's like, it's zombies. And it's like, no, it should have been like there was some kind of a crackle or something and the tech didn't work. But like, it's real lame that he can just see the zombies and they have photographic proof of zombies. And then Aiden this whole time has had a ring that was like very special to him that he was going to give to his fiance.
Yeah, his girlfriend, Penny's parents had given it to them when he broke the question to them to ask for their blessing to propose to Penny. They were like, oh, this ring is a family heirloom. He came from her great-great-great-grandmother. So you just give her this ring. So he's been kind of, for some reason, he has kept it on him in the dive suit.
It's so stupid. I don't know why he would do that. That was like a, what? And so when the zombies were clawing at him, they see on his camera that they got his ring, and so like they're like, oh, where'd he go? At one point, because they're having like lunch or dinner or something, and they find out that he went back in.
No, the morning after.
They find, oh my god, he went back in after it.
Yeah, they're like, where's Aiden? Who was the last person to see Aiden? It's like, it was 4 hours ago. It was last night in the crew room. They're like, oh my god, no, he has gone back in. Why would he do that? Hesty's suit is gone because Hesty's suit had oxygen.
And the thing is, I was like, well, R.I.P. Bye, dude. It's too bad you're gone. But they're immediately like, no, we got around to rescue. And I'm like, no, you don't. What are you doing?
That was not my reaction, Will. I was like, we have to save Aiden.
Man, he made his choice. He decided to do a dumb thing. Bye. And then they go back in to rescue him. And the problem here is that horror is about trying to like escape the horror of the monster, and it's about claustrophobia. And a lot of tension was just released by them getting back to the boat. And so them going in after him feels heroic. It doesn't feel like horror. So like in Aliens, the end of it, when Ripley goes to face the queen to get her pseudo kid, that's a heroic moment. That's not a horror moment. Horror is not like, let's face the odds no matter what. It's, oh shit, I'm trapped. I can't get out. I can't get out. And so like, this is a terrible climax.
And Aiden just going down alone, knowing what a bad diver he is, it just seems like mental illness. It doesn't really seem like I kind of get how the ring was very special, but
I think the implication, the book never explains this, but I think the implication is that he really wanted the ring, and also he feels the pull that Hesty feels for the ship. So that's influencing how he thinks. But the book never states it. I also would have liked something if maybe like in the water he had gotten some of the disease somehow. The part of the problem is that like nothing creepy can be happening to them because technically they're in like containment suits. Like there's nothing that can really touch them, especially in such a dead portion of the floor.
Yeah, and even if that fabric softener was toxic, it's been in the ocean for 100 years. Even if there was no current, even if blah blah blah, like the neurotoxin would be so diffused that a little bit of water just getting into his suit, unless he breathed in a ton of it, I can't see that being a factor that affects his mind. So what really is the pull of the ship? How does it affect people who can't breathe in the fumes, who can't? Is it a god thing? Does it just have like?
Is it a curse? It like, yeah, no, I agree. That to me was like very unmotivated. And again, I'm kind of like, well, you're a dumbass. Stay under there, bitch. Like, we're not going in after you. It's not a very good like rescue plot when you're like, you idiot.
I thought Vanna would go alone because she doesn't have anything to live for. I'm so sorry. But that was kind of the implication. She's been really sad. She's been grieving, and she feels like she's with her partner when she's in the ocean.
No, that actually would have made a lot of sense. That would have been like actually kind of a nice ending. They just find Aiden floating to the surface unconscious, and beneath it they know that Vanna didn't have enough like air to get out. Or maybe she chose not to get out because she wants to be with the ship.
Yeah, maybe she gave her oxygen to Aiden.
But to make it a climax of the book is just, it's weak. Because I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happens. The bodies are moving together almost like a jaw, and it tries to eat them, and there's flares, and then
a rat king.
Yes, exactly. And at the last moment, Sean fixes one of the drones and sends it in, and there's a bunch of light, and I was like, I guessed that this was going to be the twist at the end at the last moment. And so and then the book cuts to like I don't know, months later, and she's talking on the news, and they've decided that they're going to keep the whole thing secret. Nobody's ever going to find out that there were zombies there. They're going to decide that it's a graveyard and nobody should disturb it.
Yeah, I was like, that's kind of weak, dudes. I mean, people dive with drones and shit down to Titanic all the time.
It should have been much more something like where they're like, oh, we didn't find it. There was nothing there, and never, or something like that. And it's like, it costs them money, but they did the right thing.
The question we're supposed to be left with is how to best prevent other people from going there.
Well, the other thing we forgot to mention is all the perfunctory character development that happens at the very end of the book, where Vanna is like, oh, in that moment I could have been with my girlfriend, but I decided not to. And Cove is like, I realize now that my father's death, which she barely thinks about through the entire book, she's like, oh, I can move on from it. And I'm like, what is this?
And not a single mention or thought of her mother as well. It's like, did she even have a mother?
And we didn't even know her dad was dead till halfway through the book. She hasn't really thought about him that much. Yeah. It's literally like the author was like, oh shit, characters are supposed to go through arcs, and horror monsters are supposed to be metaphors for things. So, yeah, this is what it is. And like, it's real lame.
Also, Roy's character arc is that he reveals that he did steal the chips out of Sean's. Yeah. He did sabotage his drones. What a bastard. At that point, I was back to, fuck you, Roy. You're such a child. Right. My spontaneous reactions were that, okay, so Sean has been tinkering with these drones
this whole time and not noticed the chips are missing?
Yeah, I was like...
That's so funny.
What was his value to this crew again? If he's just a hobbyist who has bought a few drones off Amazon, why is he here? Like, shouldn't he notice that there are parts missing?
It's bizarre, because at the very end, before the last dive, he's like, oh, you know what? I should have done this before, but why don't I try to fix the comms? And so first of all, he successfully fixes them. So he had the skill, but he just didn't think about it. So it's like it's complete author fiat there of just imposed stupidness on his part.
Yeah, and it makes Sean even more of a dumb character. It's like, dude, if you had been less busy sulking, you could have fixed this right away.
It's also dropped early on that Sean is actually quite good at diving. He just doesn't have a license to do it. So I was like, okay, Chekhov's gun. At some point, he's going to have to go in, like maybe either through heroics, or he's going to be the last person who wanted to, or something like that.
He's going to be, fuck certificates. I can do this. I'm going to go.
And then once it goes down, that's when Devereaux takes control and becomes evil or whatever. But like, no, he's just there.
No.
But no. So it's like, there's a lot of inexplicable misses in this book that feel very amateurish and just like not things that a horror veteran would do. I don't know if this book really solves my issue of can prose be scary, because they weren't in this book. But this book, again, I think makes just a lot of mistakes. So I'm curious to read more horror. I want to read more horror with Lindbergh. If you guys want to see Lindbergh again, leave it in the comments below. We'll pressure her to be on screen more.
If you guys want William to read House of Leaves with me, comment down below.
I actually do kind of want to read. We should read that.
We need peer pressure, guys. Help us out.
Are there any other audiobooks you would like to, or other horror books that you found effective or you think we would find effective? Did you have any final thoughts on this? Because I'm sorry, I skipped right into asking people questions.
Yes, I do have final thoughts. First of all, I imagine this book, as it is structured now, imagine it being a World War Z, the movie type of slightly dumb action film. Water zombies, fun. Could work. It doesn't need to entirely hold together all the way to the end. It can kind of function in this slightly weird stage that it is. I think what I would have wanted out of this book is that since I got off so much on the mystery of this, I thought I had the most fun when they're just looking through the cabins and trying to figure out what has happened. They find the creepy writing on the wall. I think I would have liked the book, and it would have been scarier to me if we just never really found out, printed on the page, what happened to the ship originally. We just find the traces of something really horrible and mysterious and bad happening. And then it could have been sort of a creeping horror mystery thriller kind of thing. And the dangers could have been the very very real dangers of deep sea diving and just little things going wrong, like crates tipping over and trapping them in the holes and shit like that. Like, that was scary.
It's a bit like how the movie The Descent is like terrifying, being
Oh
stuck underground,
yeah.
and then there's cannibals, and you're like, that's also scary. But I was more scared by this other. I'm almost glad it's just cannibals and not being stuck under this weight of stone that could grind you to gristle. And
Yeah, that was really, it really knew how to capitalize on that claustrophobia. That I don't have that much claustrophobia, but I really felt that film, like them just crawling through these super narrow tunnels, and I was just dying a little bit. And the zombies kind of just, the cannibal thingies kind of just added some sort of something to run from. And it kind of worked for me there. I really like that film.
It's a good film, but again, it's like you go in expecting kind of it's one kind of horror, and then it shifts to another kind of horror, and the other kind of horror it shifts to is very good. But I think in this case of this book, it started with one kind of horror, and the horror it shifted to, it just didn't execute very well.
It would have been a scarier, sort of more existential horror-ish book. And it could have left you with that tasty imagination mystery, like your imagination could fill in the gaps, kind of like why the Dyatlov Pass mystery is so intriguing, is because you don't have the full picture. You have to leave enough blanks for the reader's imagination to fill in the most terrifying conclusion to the story. And that would have heightened it for me.
And going back to what I said back at the beginning of the tension between horror and mystery, I think one of the ways you can resolve that is you resolve the mysteries that you introduced at the beginning of the book, but you leave with mysteries that are themselves new mysteries that are unsettling, or some kind of an emotion that's unsettling, or you don't fully explain it, you unveil it enough. You had a really good way you put this like 2 days ago, but I can't look through our chat logs. It was one of these things where like you should never reveal completely what's happening to the audience, but you as the author should know, but you as the author shouldn't know all of it either, or something like that.
Yeah, the author should have an overall premise for what the story is and what happened. But the point with creating horror in written text is to make the reader feel as if they have opened a door and glimpsed something horrifying that is just beyond anything they could have imagined. And that is the terror.
I agree. And that was the way I think you put it that I thought was very eloquent.
We have kind of been, nitpicking this book to death now, but I still liked it.
I still found it very engaging. I think, again, I read through a lot of it. I just think it's one of these things where if like this was a first book, I would be like, oh, she's got, this is going to be good in like 2 or 3 years. She's going to really refine this. But I don't think this is even one of her first. I think this is like 5 or 6 or something like that.
She has written a lot of horror books. It reminds me of when I read The Hollow Places by T. Kingfisher. Who is a pseudonym for Ursula Vernon. And to this day, I think that is her best book. And I read it, and I thought some bits were really good, some bits were really creepy, and then it kind of fell apart at the end. So I was like, okay, has she written more things? I am very curious to read more horror that she writes in the future to see if she improves on this thing. But when you find an author like this, who is very established already in the genre. Ooh, I'm hungry. Anyway, who's very established in the genre, and you see at this kind of late stage, or at least middle stage in their career, and they still have these really huge structural errors, it doesn't feel like we will get a better story if we go back and read some older books they have written.
I agree. Unless there was some kind of like, she had 5 days to write this kind of a situation or something like that.
Or maybe she has written a plot that she herself is more at home with, maybe, and can execute it better. I don't know, because Deep Sea is very specific, like, obviously.
Different genres, too. I've said before that whoever wrote Shadow and Bone, I'm blanking on her name, but she's, like, her contemporary stuff I find to be less annoying. Leigh Bardugo, yeah. I find her contemporary stuff to be, like, less annoying than her old-timey stuff because it fits her style a little better. So if you guys have read some of this author, Darcy Coates, and you think some of her other books are better suited, I'm always up for reading, for giving authors a second chance, even though I have no real hope. Trust but verify. Any last thoughts then, Lindbergh, before we leave them?
If you are looking to get into horror and you like the idea, if you find the idea of diving into a sunken ship and finding some really scary shit, if you find the premise intriguing, go read the book because it's a good time, even if it's not perfect. Like, some bits are really good, so I would recommend it. Would you recommend it, Will?
Probably not, just because if they've made it to this point in the video, they know what the end of the mystery is, and the mystery is really the best part of this book, is the sense of, like, what's going to happen.
That's a bit. But okay, let's say you meet someone on the street, and for some reason, against all odds, you feel like you do want to talk to them, and if they ask for a recommendation, and they are not ardent horror fans, like they haven't read everything and watched every single movie, they aren't as jaded as you and me, would you recommend the book?
I think so. A lot of people do find this book scary, and I think if you innately find underwater stuff scary, I think this can be a fun read. Again, I read it in one sitting. It's fun.
Guys, this is a momentous occasion. We should have a stamp for this book, like will approve.
It's still only like lukewarm in terms of ranking.
Hey, any book that crawls over that very high bar.
All right. We love you all, our parasocial darlings.
Bye.